Alright, guys. Seems like we're up, and seems like we're back. So, this is Mr. Spade talking to you again about all these incredible things about these guitars, right? And, hey, like I promised, I'd be back to talk about the original collection. I know yesterday's stream was a little bit cut short because, well, let's just say I wanted to make sure that we address the original collection separately, and I do have some interesting things to say because I have played many of these original collection guitars by now, and they do have specific things that you will for sure find interesting. All right, so when we talk about that, I just want to take you guys through my main impressions. What did I think? And as somebody who's tried out, let's say, 3 different eras of Les Pauls and all these guitars, there is definitely a difference. Is it as big a deal as people are saying it is? We're going to find out and kind of just let you know what I thought about it from a personal touch and feel point of view. Because, you can hear 1,000 people talking about this and you can see a lot of people review them. But you know what? Most review channels just get them in their hands and, they noodle with it for about 30 minutes to an hour maybe. Whereas I've had the, let's say, the privilege to actually play them over a long period of time and use them in studio recordings, use them in live situations, and definitely be able to use them in jam sessions, which are just a little bit crazier than both of them. All right, so let me just switch over here and let's have a better look at what we were talking about. All right, and when I say that the original collection really should be treated with a separate regard, what I really mean is that, look, there's a lot of things that can change the way that you feel about something. Okay? Definitely, there's a lot of things that can do that. But it's quite rare for people to, completely change their opinion on something just based on a refresh, right? And I think ideology has a lot to do with this. Just what people have been feeling, what people have been thinking, opinions being heard, and so on. So let's recap a little bit. So Gibson has had different eras, and in the last decade or so, all the way up until the first half of 2019, it was a very modern-focused sort of an era. And definitely a lot of people made their voices heard because, when there's something that's considered heritage and kind of like a flagship, when you change things about the flagship, people are always going to question it, and you're always going to have a big debate about, whether this is how it's supposed to be, whether it follows tradition or not, and whether innovation is necessary. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of cool things to go over there, all the way from talking about the automatic tuners, which pretty sure nobody liked, or thinking about, the fact that weight relieving got taken to an extreme, and just how that affected everything, how it affected the expectations of the people, and how it affected the way something feels, what they're used to. But at the same time, I think an interesting conversation when we talk about heritage and when we talk about innovation is people, the artists. What do they want? And how have times changed? How has mainstream changed within the past few years to affect that? Because I feel like everybody needs to adapt, at least to some extent. And if you don't adapt, you will never ever be able to expand on, new markets and new types of customers. And definitely people who are very much considering buying into your ecosystem, but maybe might not because they just don't feel like their needs are catered for. And that's where we go back to talking about heritage and talking about, the expectations of people. Because at the end of the day, it's about evolution. And my personal take is this, okay? If you don't add new features to a collection, if you don't evolve things, they get stale. Then you're just doing the same thing over and over again. The definition of insanity, right? However, hear me out. The fact that the flagship has to take that kind of, hit, as some people would see it as, is what pisses people off. Okay. So that's where if you take the standard and you say, you know what, the standard is the standard, by definition, the flagship, and then you mess around with it, even though that was the spirit of the standard, to innovate, right? That's what the man Les Paul wanted. You really start to affect the nostalgia that people have. You start to affect the value in their eyes, right? And this becomes a big debate between the nostalgia lovers, right, traditionalists, and obviously the modern crowd, which are, budding guitar players, people who are new, people who are coming into it, and people who are listening to modern music, which is different. It's not the same as the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. It's not the same as, let's say, the 80s and 90s with the hard rock revolution or grunge or early 2000s alternative. Things change, like the early 2010s were all gent. They were filled with so many different things, and the late 2000s were all like hardcore and screamo and all these bands, right? And that's where we come to our main question, okay? Transformation and innovation. Does it have to be on the flagship, or can you provide that but make it something else, make it an alternative that people can consider if they are modern players, right? And this is where we come down to the original collection, because in 2019, in the second half, obviously with, after a few years of bankruptcy and lots of discussion on neck width and, tuners and all these crazy things, it's like starting over, going back to the basics and fixing things and making them right. And this is why it makes such a big difference for Gibson to be able to provide to their traditional base the very best that they expect. And that's exactly what they did. They went back to the basics and they came up with the original collection to make sure that they are as faithful as they can be on a consumer level basis without going too far into, custom shop or any of these more expensive things, and giving the people what they want. Pricing has a lot to do with it, of course. And for the first time ever, you saw Les Pauls that were cheaper than the past few years, which I don't know if that's ever happened. I'm sure it may have, but it's definitely not common, right? And that's where we talk about this. So I want to take you guys to kind of like a little bit of a look with what the original collection really signifies and what are the two main things you need to know about with the new Les Pauls, with the original collection Les Pauls. Now that I've had one for a while, and I haven't gotten to a review on that, but I will, and there's a lot of interesting things to talk about. There's definitely certain things that change the whole landscape and change the way that I felt about Gibson and their guitars. I'm somebody who's had more modern spec not traditionals, more modern spec standards. I did own a traditional back in 2010, which was kind of a modern type of traditional, right? It did have 9-hole weight relief on it. That was the only thing modern about it, because traditionals are technically not supposed to be weight relief, right? And we'll talk about weight relief a lot when we get to these guitars. So let's have a look at the Gibson Original Collection. And yesterday, where I stopped streaming, I was talking about the 50s model. I want to talk about that a little bit. Let's go over here and have a look at the standard 50s. And this is where we kind of stopped. I know I spoke a little bit about, the neck. I talked a little bit about the tuners, so and so. But I do want to talk in depth about what the traditional has essentially evolved into as a new standard. Because the new standards, technically speaking, are kind of like the traditionals of yesteryear. The traditionals of the past few years where, Gibson took away all the weight relief and they made them properly traditional again. And these were some of the best guitars that Gibson produced for the traditionalists, right? But the fact that the name said traditional and not standard, that really got to some people. They want it to be known as the standard because this is the standard that they remember, the one that they consider a symbol of a big age of rock and roll, right? So when we look at this over here, this is basically the standard, right? This is the standard as people remember it, and Gibson knows where their hardcore fan base is, and they want to cater to that fan base. So this is a welcome change on a lot of levels, because they didn't just stop there. As I showed you guys yesterday, they went deep into the modern collection as well, and then they made that into a semi-focus for the company. It's like they're sharing the stage half and a half modern and half traditional, right? And when you talk about that, everybody's happy in some ways. There's still some specs that I wish they would do in my style. Looking at the 50s standard, people just expect gold tops because these were the earliest Les Pauls, right? So you've got a gold top there with 2 humbuckers. You've got the Heritage Cherry. The Cherry Sunburst is the quintessential, the original Les Paul, right? 2 major finishes that really defined the 58 and the 59. Going into the whole burst era kind of a thing. The Heritage Cherry Sunburst and the Tobacco Burst. Look at this Tobacco Burst. That's pretty, man. I love the Tobacco Burst. These 2 tones of burst are basically what people mainly remember as the 58s and the 59s, and obviously 60s as well, before the LP was discontinued. But this is what they remember. This is the standard 50s. If you're looking for like a 59 kind of a thing, this is your guitar. Now here are my thoughts. When I tried out the neck on these are not fat 58 necks. They're not. They're pretty much exactly like 59 necks. So 59 necks are actually very similar to 60s necks, but the difference is they're rounded. So basically, they're not as flat on the back. They have a very curvy sort of a thing to them, okay? And that's what I noticed. That was one of the biggest. It is slightly bigger, okay? And I don't think it's a huge amount, but obviously you do feel it when you play it. And it does fill your hand up a lot more just because it's rounded. So there's extra wood along the shoulders. It's all about the shoulders. Trust me. I've had one sanding job on a 2010 traditional, which was excellent. Then recently I had a sanding job that pretty much ruined one of my Les Pauls, and I have to rebuild that when I can afford it. So these standards, the 50 standards, really do feel like that. They really do feel like rounded 59 necks. I didn't think that they were slower or faster when I played up and down the fretboard, but I did feel very much like they were rounded. And that's a great thing, because it just means they're built more for comfort rather than for modern shreddery. You know, it's not really a shreddy sort of a guitar. It's more like just a more comfortable one. It doesn't mean it's slower. It just means it's got more shoulder, which a lot of people really, really like. If you have bigger hands and you're feeling like the necks are not substantial enough for you and you don't feel them as much, that's what you want. I know people that love baseball necks and 58 necks and huge ones, and this standard 50s honestly feels like a 59 neck. So if you're looking for that Holy Grail Les Paul feel, I think this is where you'll find it. Now, number 2, after we talk about the neck, my impressions on the weight relief. Guys, you're not going to believe this, okay? Because the common opinion I've heard is that without your weight relief, the guitar is going to be uber heavy. It's not. It's really not. Yes, it's substantial. You feel the weight, you do. And for sure, it has a lot to do with the woods and, you know, what's going into it and so and so. But I tried out many examples. Some of them, honestly speaking, do not feel heavy at all. I found them at a, you know, let's say a lower bound of about 8.5 pounds, which is really light. That's weight relief level light. But the more common ones that I found were between 4 kgs. So I'm just trying to convert, sorry. So they were about 9 to 11 pounds. 11 is the maximum that I saw. I didn't see one over 11. And I tried out around 7 or 8 of these. And the thing about the traditional is, traditional weight, I mean, is that these can vary. So what I would recommend is try out different ones and see which one really feels nice in your hand. It's all about the balance. Okay, so if on the neck and the body side you do see a bit more balance, and when you put it in your lap you do feel like it's not heavy or not bearing down on you, that's it. Even if that thing's like 10 pounds, you're not really going to worry about it so much, right? So that's the interesting part about it. And let's talk about something else. Let's talk about the fact that you're always going to have so many different opinions and so many different types of people with different sizes of hands and different preferences and so and so. Ergonomics, right? I feel like they're just as modern as they were in 1959, you know, which is pretty good. I know that there's always going to be smaller things that change it up, but it's not that big of a difference, really. I'm telling you, after going through so many different ones, it's really not that big of a difference. Yes, it is impactful in certain situations, but in a big picture sort of a way, I mean, it's not really that different, you know? So these are still what they used to be, and having a standard 50s is absolutely a pleasure because they really do feel like that 59 thing. Now let's talk about the burst buckers, okay? Look, there's only one kind of burst bucker that I hate, and that's the BB Pro. And I don't hate it because it's bad. Don't get me wrong. I hate it just because it doesn't suit my needs, and because it's a little bit shrill for what I want to do with my amps. But the burst bucker 1 and 2 are the sweetest sounding burst buckers I've heard from a vintage point of view. All right, they got Alnico 2s. You can't go wrong with Alnico 2s. I've almost never heard a bad Alnico 2 pickup. It's very rare. And A2 pickups are basically what you're supposed to get with these, and they sounded really nice. And you know what? The audio taper pots really do sound super nice, and they're very responsive to exactly how much you turn, and you can get the smooth, really sustainy sort of tone, and that's it. You know, that's the Les Paul tone. And they got orange drop capacitors in there, and it feels like it, dude. It really does. Okay, so this is where the 59 Les Paul is reimagined and brought back. And just looking over here, you'll notice. Look at these beautiful pickups and you know, the nice gold knobs and everything. I want you to look at the top on this guitar. All right, let me try and zoom in a little bit so you guys can see better. So here's something else that I noticed. The tops on the 50s were not as, let's say, not as flamey as, let's say, a modern AAA or a quadruple A top, you know. But they're not meant to be. They're meant to be just, let's say, a mild level of flame. That's what the 59s signified, right? So when you think about it that way, you got to understand that, honestly speaking, it's so faithful from an economical consumer point of view that you almost get the same feeling. And this is where the biggest thing happens, right? Because all of these appointments kind of follow the same thing, and you've got your plastic looking cloisons and everything, and everything's so vintage, right? You do really get the vibe that this actually feels more like a reissue. It doesn't really feel like a consumer lineup. It feels like a custom shop lineup. And I know that's a lot to say, but I'm just talking about this is the difference between the last 7-8 years of standards and the 2019 second half standard 50s and standard 60s. It's something that you can really feel, and even though it is definitely a little bit heavier, like it's noticeably heavier, they're very well balanced, so they don't feel like they're dragging down or that they're either body heavy or neck heavy. It's just not how it is. So you are looking at something that's very cool indeed, and based on my trial, my opinion, one humble man's opinion, pretty much everything was on point. All right, I don't really have much bad to say about it. I want to be as critical as I can, but there's just nothing. Like, there's just nothing I can think of at the moment to be super critical of. I think there's a couple of custom shop lineups which are really cool, which work with super light woods, and then they give you like around 8 pounds. These are like super light, okay? Solid bodies, but they're really light. I prefer lighter. I think something like that would be awesome, like for a little bit of an extra premium to get one of those super lights. Not a lot of, not custom shop money, but let's say maybe, you go up or down $500, you can really get somebody like me. So that's the only thing I can say about these. Again, they're not super heavy, and they're wired really well. They have vintage wiring, and they're super nice. You got ABR1 style bridges, and very cool overall. All right, so now I want to take you guys and I want to look at the 60s. And this is something I'm very excited to talk about because I have a 60s. And I have exactly the one that you see on the screen. It's a very pretty iced tea sort of a thing. And honestly speaking, this is where I really, really kind of scratched my head a little bit because I tried out so many 60s Les Pauls. The number one thing that I notice is that the necks feel awesome. I'm telling you, these are like 59 thickness necks, so maybe just a little bit thinner. I haven't measured them, so I don't know. But based on feel, that's how they felt. But they're like a bit flatter, so they are faster to move around with, and they have less shoulder. So what you see as a profile, the 60s neck really is something amazing. And when you talk about that, you know, the slim taper nature to this neck is just perfect because honestly speaking, I feel like this is the perfect level. I've played so many Charvel and Ibanez necks that are so thin and they're nice, but they're not versatile. You know, they don't cover like a broad range of things. They're not all rounders. This is the one thing bad that I can say about the 60s for me, right? Because as somebody who likes to get super versatile with the stuff, the 50s is great, right? But it's just when you compare it with the 60s, for a guy like me, for the kind of stuff that I play, this is a lot more versatile. Just because the neck is a lot more, you know, in line with faster playing, and it feels more comfortable to me because my hands are not the biggest, right? This is where you can really, really think about the kind of stuff that you play. If you're more into, I would say, you know, classic rock and going into sort of like a early 2000s alternative sort of a scene, I feel like this is pretty much the perfect thing. Of course, this is a 60s guitar, so there's like hundreds and hundreds of great musicians who've wielded a 60s guitar. But that's it. It's all about that neck, you know? That neck makes all the difference in the world, you know? And for me, I think my biggest preference has always been the right neck. And then I've got other preferences. My second biggest is weight. So I did try out a lot of 60s standards. The 60s standards definitely were in the same weight ballpark as a 50s, but for me, I found more lighter ones in the 60s, even though they're all solid bodies, right? But I'll tell you the real star of the show that you don't expect, okay? The real star of the show, when you think about the 60s standard, is right here. It's these two pickups. These pickups are not at all what I imagined. So the last burst buckers I was using were the pros. And the pros were not really, let's just say they didn't really suit me that well. They were okay at the start. You know, you can tweak around with them, and the pros, they do sound okay, but they're a bit harsh for my taste. When I went into these specific burst bucker 61s, here's how I can describe them, okay? They're kind of like the 498T, which is one of my current favorites, but they sound fuller. They sound more on the character of the 57 Classic. So imagine you took a 57 Classic Plus and you added a lot of power to it, and you gave it the response of an Alnico 5 magnet while keeping the clarity, right? This is where I feel like the 61, the BB61s really make a huge difference. And I really noticed such a strong presence from these pickups, and they just sounded great. You know, you have so many different pickups in these ranges, and I did not at all expect them to be good. I was very much expecting to have to swap them out pretty fast because I know that I have a preference, but sound perfect for my needs. And I think the 60 standard really does stand out as the all-rounder. So when you think about all-rounders, really, I would say that this would suit a lot of modern styles as well, and the classics, right? And they've got Alnico 5 magnets, you know what I mean? So pretty much my favorite type of magnets these days, because they're very responsive and they distort well, but they don't take it over the top so much, you know? So when you think about these things, you don't want it to be too excessive. I know there's people who are really crazy about it, and if you're going Alnico, you know, don't go too overpowered, because they're supposed to sound more on the sweeter high end rather than a harsher high end, and that's where it really makes a huge difference. Now when you think about ceramic pickups, that's a whole different debate that probably I should bring up at some point, because I've tried a few ceramic ones and there's interesting things to say there, I feel. But yeah, the 60 standard probably more my thing. and very happy with it. Super, super happy with it. It really is something awesome. In fact, let me see if I can pull this out. So when you think about 60 standards, look, I got it right here. Look at that top. I promise you, in person, when you see this, it really does feel like a reissue. Let me just put this back. Alright, so my whole point of bringing that up is the top. Okay? The tops on the 60s were noticeably better than the 50 standards. And they're meant to be, because at that point of the era, I guess they were going with more flamier tops. The 59s and the 58s were not that flamey. In fact, the 58s were not very flamey at all. And I guess progressively, the flame tops have just gotten more and more figured, right? As does, you know, the premium that comes with it. But I just showed you the top on that. It says AA, by the way. It says AA top, but it's not. That can easily be graded as a AAA. I know there's going to be a lot of people who go crazy about that, but I've owned many AAA tops in the past. And, yeah, this does. I feel like it does qualify. It's just my opinion. Don't kill me. It's very reminiscent of like just like a super, super nice top. Obviously not very, very book matched, or it's not a quadruple A top or like something like a PRS 10 top or anything like that. So it's not supposed to be perfect, but it is beautiful and incredibly figured. You know, that's where the 60s Les Paul really, really shines. I feel like compared to the 50s, the tops were definitely a step up on many of the examples that I saw. Again, you'd have to try them out in person. You really need to see these tops before you buy them, because they can really, really vary. Like I saw some 60s that were barely figured at all, or some that had some figuring, but you had to just catch it in the right light. But then you saw some like that one, which were just very nicely flamey. I wouldn't say they were, quadruple A or anything like that, but they were super, super nice. So my recommendation out of the two, if you're more of a modern mixed with a bit of classic player, you go with the 60s. It is a super nice neck. It's really not thin. I'm telling you, this is not like some of the thinner 60s necks that I've played. The 60s necks on these slim taper necks feel slightly fatter. They feel a bit more comfortable. I don't know what they did. I'm sure the measurements and everything are the same, but they really do feel amazing, and they're very, very cool. My example weighs exactly 9 pounds. I can't go above this number, honestly. And I'm not even into buying a 9-pound Les Paul as much, but the thing is, when it balances right, you don't feel the weight as much. You barely feel it. So this is one of the best things about it. And yeah, guys, so that's a look at the 60s standard. Really not much else to say. If I want to zoom in, I want to just remind you that the way you can tell the difference is by looking at the tuners. Okay, the tuners are going to be obviously these nice Grovers. You're going to see these kidney-shaped Grovers on them. You go down from here, and you're going to see a much better top. Okay, better for me. Better for me, right? But like, if you prefer a less figured, more 59-esque top, you will get it in the traditionals. And yeah, so these tops are super nice. Another difference you'll notice here are the knobs. The knobs are reflector knobs, and honestly, these feel really good. Again, those CTS pots with the audio taper pots with this wiring that they've got going on. I'm not sure what they did exactly, but it's very different from last standards. It's very responsive to how much you turn the dial. It's very, very well done. The tones you can get out of it, it's just a much bigger range. Like, technically, I feel like Gibson didn't have to do all that crazy dip switch stuff after all. If you just work with this, you have pretty huge range of tones when you put in pots like this. It's really cool. And last thing, and the most important thing I want to talk about here, is your 61 burst buckers. Some of my new favorites. Honestly speaking, again, I know there's a lot of traditionals around, but based on what I've heard and to my ears, they sound a lot like T-tops. T-tops are the 70s pickups, which are excellent pickups as well. they really do sound as powerful as the T-tops, or at least they give me that kind of a vibe, you know? So that's the vibe I get from the Burstbucker 61s, guys. And honestly, look at these. You got iced tea, you got Bourbon Burst. Bourbon Burst is more of the tobacco-y sort of the equation, whereas, I mean, iced tea is more dark brown as opposed to red. And obviously you've got yourself your Unburst. Unburst is more the Gary Moore guitar sort of a burst, but I'm telling you something. These look a bit more like the greeny Les Paul in pictures than they do in person. In person, what I noticed was they do have more of an orange hue around, so you do see the bursty side of it. You definitely do. It's just that to make it look like the Gary Moore guitar or like the like the greeny guitar, you would have to wait a lot of years for it to fade, and then it would look like that honey bursty thing that you get. And that's what I noticed. So I was originally planning to go with an Unburst, but it just didn't happen. Bourbon Burst, again, as I mentioned, is tobacco, and you've got your iced tea, which is my personal favorite, and the one that you just saw with the very pretty flame, in my opinion. So, guys, we looked at the 50s and the 60s. Let me know in the comments what you think of these guitars. What were your experiences like, if you agree with what I said? And not much else here to discuss, except, you know what, you do have a 50s version with the P90s. Obviously, the earliest Les Pauls were P90s Les Pauls, and these sound killer as well. So I very much recommend you check them out. And yeah, guys, I don't want to harp too much in this video. I know yesterday's video was a lot longer. I do plan to make a lot more. I want to go in depth on a lot of different guitars here and stuff, but I did want to go through the original collection step by step. So we actually, you know, were able to share some of those first impressions, in-person impressions of what they're like. Because specs on a sheet can only tell you so much, but personal experience really makes a huge difference. All right. So guys, thank you so much if you're joining me, and I appreciate if you'd support my channel. I really do. Shamelessly plugged. You can sub to the channel. You can leave me a like. It would mean a lot because my channel is very small. All right. And it would help it grow and kind of motivate me to do more of these. All right. And I will catch you guys in a stream very soon. Thanks a lot, guys.